The title of the Child Welfare Virtual Expo Session 2 is Opening the Door: Frameworks and Strategies to Develop and Implement Successful Trauma-Informed Programs to Address Child and Youth Sex Trafficking. The moderator is Charmaine Britton, Butler Institute for Families.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Charmaine Britton, and I hope you enjoyed the networking lounge, or I should say the virtual networking lounge. Just as a reminder, if you cannot hear us, but you can see us, please turn up your computer speakers. And if you need additional assistance, please check out our help desk. During this session, Opening the Door, we're going to start with a TED-style talk from a woman who has survived sex trafficking. We'll have a panel to talk about trauma-informed approaches to screening and assessment. And we're going to hear from another survivor, and we'll see the digital story that she has created. And lastly, we're going to conclude with orienting you to the resources that are available from the center. Through the course of this session, we're going to explain how trauma impacts the adolescent brain and body. We're going to describe how trauma-informed approaches work. We're going to help you understand how to implement trauma-informed approaches to screening and identification from our experts here in the field. And most importantly, we're going to orient you to those training resources to help you develop a trauma-informed, culturally sensitive, and LGBTQ-informed approach to screening and identification. All of this is going to help you build your capacity. Right now, I am very pleased to introduce Wilhelma Tiara Ortiz Walker Pettigrew. And luckily, she's just known as T. She's going to talk to us about what it's really like to open and walk through that door.
Thank you so much, Charmaine. And I want to say thank you to everybody. This is an amazing opportunity to contribute here at the, let me not mess it up, Virtual Child Welfare Conference. I mean, there's so many partnerships that made this possible and made this happen. And you know, the invitation and opportunity to contribute here today is definitely my honor. So I come to you with a variety of unique experiences, not only as a consultant who consults on federal policy, but also as a consumer of services, spending most of my childhood within foster care. But furthermore, doing and providing first response by also being a youth advocate within child welfare, and also running a drop-in center, helping young girls get off the street from child commercial sex trafficking. And I'm currently also a mentor to many young women and men across the country. So again, a majority of my experience comes from that initial time in care, but also where I spent 14 plus placements, also spending 7 years of my life being trafficked from the ages 10 to 17 while being in foster care, both on the streets, on the internet, in the back of express pages, massage parlors, strip clubs, any way that you can name it. For 7 years, that was my reality. And furthermore, I had equal or more experience working with the child welfare system in state and federal policy, in first response, and specifically with young people themselves. So what I want to do is give you kind of a concise framework of how foster care renders young people more vulnerable for sex trafficking. And this is a lot of information, so I'm hoping you can catch up and keep up with me, essentially. So the first way I would say is that young people normalize the experience of being used as an object of financial gain. So let's talk about reality. A lot of us know that there are foster parents who get into this only for the financial gain of the money. And oftentimes, young people are not being treated or taken care of with that same financial compensation that they're supposed to be. Oftentimes they're referred to by their foster parents and said, hey, you're nothing but a paycheck. You know, as long as I get my checks, I'm not worried about what happens to you. So what happens for these young people is that they normalize the behaviors and actions towards them by accepting that they are of use to be used for someone's financial gain. You know, and so when I say this, it's really important because when young people really normalize this behavior, what I need to really highlight is that they don't see the difference in bringing financial gain to a foster home as much different as they would bringing financial gain or income to a pimp stable. I will be using the term pimp, exploiter, trafficker interchangeably, so please feel free to keep up with me. Another way is that, everybody who knows about foster care and child welfare knows that there's various people who control young people's lives. We have the social worker, the foster parents, the CASA workers, there's public defenders. The list goes on. Oftentimes what happens is this it disallows young people to gain meaningful attachments, specifically within their community, or attachments that are not contingent on services and systems and placements. So that is definitely an issue. I can say from my experience myself, the longest and most stable relationship that I had while in care was that with my exploiter, with my pimp. And that is not something that should be the reality for our young people. So we have to take heed to how that renders young people. We also have, the pimps, the exploiters, the traffickers, they have no fear of punishment. There has been a lot of forgetting about the fact that young people need to be known and it needs to be made aware that they are missing. But the problem is that because young people come from foster care, oftentimes it is thought that they are just always assumed to be runaways. Well, this means that there's no Amber Alerts. This means that there's no flyers going around. So the pimps know that no one is looking out for them or looking for them. So they know that they're able to continue to exploit this person commercially without fear of consequence. Another reason that young people are vulnerable for sex trafficking is that, again, the instability. Young people move from home to home to home. Again, going back to the earlier statement, lack of connections, always being told one thing or another. And so the lack of stability, when you're moved from home to home to home to home, myself and other young people I've worked with says that for them, it was just as equal from moving from home to home to hotel to hotel. So I don't want to just talk about all the bad things without talking about some solutions. And so when I talk about how, young people feel like they're nothing but a paycheck oftentimes, and they're, normalizing the idea of being used as an object of financial gain by the foster care system, I think that there are things that we can do in place to really work towards bettering this position. One of those things that I feel is assisting young people in creating healthy relationships with money. Again, there is funding given and contributed to the caregivers of these young people for the betterment and the well-being of these young people. But sometimes that just doesn't happen. The young people often don't see their clothing allowances. They don't see, getting their daily needs met, whether that's hygiene or otherwise. And so one thing that I encourage to our entire child welfare system federally is we need to consider something, as what I call, it's kind of my own idea, called an emancipation bank account. So we put a certain amount of money aside per month that a child is in care, and it could be a small amount, $10, $20, but that's saved up for the young person's emancipation furthermore. We have to assist young people in building community that is not contingent on system and services. That cannot be highlighted enough. We have to establish better ways to inform the public of missing children, and do not always assume that children from the foster care are runaways. Are they still not in danger? But you know what? We've got amazing advancements with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So big shout out to them, because we're trying to make ways and avenues to sort this out and get better possibilities. We have to have more stability of placements. This is preaching to the choir. I know there's a lot of people, there's already a lack of placements and there's limited placements, but we need placements that really establish open door policies and have open beds so that we can give young people consistency. And lastly, I think we need to advocate strongly for what is known as TDMs and TLCs. These are meetings that establish the center as the young person in their community and everybody that is important specifically to that of the system. Casey Family Programs has done a great job in establishing a toolkit, and that is also a resource. So I thank you so much, and we're looking forward to the panel.
Thank you so much, T. We really appreciate you helping us to set the context for our session. So thank you very much. And now I'd like to open it up to our panel. Here with me today we have Melissa Snow, a nationally known expert in child and youth sex trafficking. and she is from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And also we have Tammy Sneed, who's the Director of Human Trafficking Services from Connecticut, and you just heard from T. Before we get started on our panel, though, we're going to have some polling questions. So if you all want to hang on with me, we want to involve you, our audience, in what we're doing. So we have some polling questions to find out what you're doing. Please use the panels to respond to our questions. The first question is, does your agency employ a trauma-informed lens? Please answer yes or no. And if you'd like to tell us how that trauma-informed lens looks like, please use the Q&A function.
The polling results for this question and the next two polling questions are not visible on screen.
T just spoke to us about the trauma that you experienced, and it's really important that our child welfare systems also pay attention to that by using a trauma-informed lens. And it looks like we have some results coming in, and I see a lot of yeses up there. That's good news. And we're going to leave that open for just a little while longer. The whole concept of trauma, as you all know, or in our panel, has been really important to child welfare agencies over the last few years, and it looks like agencies are paying heed to that, and most of them are now using a trauma-informed lens. Let's now go on to our second question, and our second question is, does your agency have a formal screening protocol? Yes or no? And if so, please tell us what it is. What is the name of your screening protocol? We'll tell you more about our resources later in the program as well. Okay, so let's see. On this, it looks like we're having some mixed results. Most agencies have, of this group of people who are answering the question, do have screening protocols. Not everybody, though. It looks like it's about 60-40. Okay, let's now go to our third question. If you have a screening protocol, are you training people in the use of that instrument? I think that's especially important at this point, and Tammy and Melissa will be talking about that people are prepared to use these because, as T just talked about, there's a lot going on that need to be attended to. And it looks like we do have a good percentage of agencies that are engaging in training to prepare people to use that protocol. So great, that's good to know. All right, now we're going to turn to our panel. And I have some questions that I'm going to ask you all. And we're going to start with data because we like to be an evidence-informed system. So Melissa, can you please share any data that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has on the connection between child sex trafficking and children in care? T has already told us the reality of it. What's the data say?
Absolutely. Thanks, Charmaine. At the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we took a look at our data, and this is what we found. In 2015, 1 out of every 5 runaways reported to us at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was also likely a victim of child sex trafficking.
Wow.
1 out of every 5. And as we further unpack that number, we found that 74% of those kids who were actively missing and currently being exploited were missing from social services or child welfare, were in the care of social services and child welfare when they went missing.
Wow.
So that really shows us a pattern of not all of the types of victims that are being trafficked, but certainly who is most vulnerable for being targeted by traffickers.
Sure, that's huge a number of kids. This question is for Tammy. When you think about what T just talked about, when are agencies most effective at addressing this?
Well, T really gave us a lot to think about, and I've had the pleasure of listening to T many times and knowing T for a number of years. she really talks about the need for the young person to be center, to be at the table in the planning process. And I think too often, I see this all the time, we start planning for a child and she or he is nowhere near that table, and then we tell them what they're going to do. And it really is, it's not, they're not in a place to be able to do what we're designing for them. They need to help us to design the approach for them. The other thing that really jumps out in regards to T's presentation is stability. She talks about all the different placements she was in, and we know on a regular basis we have the need to do some rapid placements with kids, but there's a significant impact to the young people that we're just kind of placing, and we go home at the end of the night feeling comfortable that we got that young person in a safe place, but it may not be the ideal setting, it may not have been planned, and he or she may not have been at the table helping us plan for that. So I think those were the two really strong areas that stood out with T. Lots of other things, but those, I think, are things we can really address as child welfare systems.
Thank you.
Sure.
Melissa, what would you add to that?
Absolutely. Well, I couldn't agree more with what Tammy just said. And in adding to that, I think one of the other important pieces is that while child welfare is certainly recognizing that all forms of child sex trafficking is child sexual abuse, we're also realizing that we absolutely need to adapt all of our current systems. We need to look at how we intake, how we screen, how we identify, how we determine placements. And really giving a shout out to Tammy in Connecticut, because that's exactly what they've done in their system. They've looked at every single aspect of it and figured out how they needed to specialize specifically for this population. And part of that specialized adaptation is figuring out other members of your multidisciplinary team or partnership that actually have to be at the table. And as T mentioned, the primary vulnerability in her story and in so many others that I've heard is that the desire for relationship, for connection, for belonging, right? And so we have to build in community-based providers into that crisis response that has the flexibility to stick with young people regardless of their age, regardless of what agency they bounce to, what county they move to, or how they age out of the system or transition into other programs. A good community-based provider has that flexibility to build and maintain a continuous and consistent relationship long-term. We know that young people who have been trafficked have been hurt in relationship, and they need to heal in relationship, and that the relationship is really the intervention.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And let's talk a little bit about a trauma-informed approach. I'd like to direct this question to T first. T, from your perspective, what makes for a trauma-informed approach?
So first, for people to understand that trauma has no template. There is not one way it looks. You know, one person who is traumatized may be more quiet and reclusive. Another traumatized person may be more outspoken, needing for attention. So first of all, we need to understand that there is no trauma template. A lot of people ask me, well, what should I look for? There's various signs. It's all dependent on the individual. We also need to be aware that and have cultural competence of kind of the understanding and have more, I wouldn't even say competence, I would say come from a lens of empathy versus sympathy. If we start to work with young people in regards to meeting them where they're at, understanding where they're at, understanding their small successes, that is important. Also, trauma-informed approach has to do with motivational interviewing. Those are necessary tools to really focus on those strength-based opportunities, things like that with the young people. And they have to understand trauma reactions, which I know my panelists will definitely lay out. But trauma reactions can look different from every and each individual. And we also cannot assume that sexual identity is a marker to trauma, which is a very big, important piece that I think we leave out in the conversation. But we have to really understand mostly about trauma that there's no template, and each approach is going to be individualized to that unique young person.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that. What about you, Tammy? What would you say? You're doing that in Connecticut right now.
Right, and I think it's about a trauma-informed approach, and there's no magic template. We have models out there. Connecticut has been very focused on that issue for many, many years. It's also about a trafficking-informed approach, understanding that these kids We often use the word victim just because it's powerful when we're training, but when we're working with the kids, we use the word survivor because
Right.
they really are. But it's about identifying them as such. And in years past, have talked about her jumping in and out of the juvenile justice system. And that was child welfare's response to her trauma. And that was really unfortunate. So really having everyone have that lens, whether we're talking about child welfare, law enforcement, juvenile justice, our providers, our community, society. Too often I have seen survivors talk across the country about some of their horrific experiences and then them be judged as well. So it's about how we look and work with these survivors, and it's about those stable relationships being there no matter what. Melissa talks about the importance of these relationships, and because of the trauma that these kids have gone through, they are going to truly test these relationships. And the folks that are on that journey with them need to be in it with them through the good and the bads, the ups and the downs.
Excellent. Melissa, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure, just adding to kind of really piggybacking on what both T and Tammy have said. You know, I think it's important that we talk about there are trauma-specific interventions and trauma-informed interventions. And I love the fact that our trauma-informed conversation has expanded outside of the therapeutic relationship to truly everybody that's a part of the agency. And in all child-serving agencies, especially in child welfare, where the whole purpose is responding and providing services and support to traumatized young people, everybody across that agency, from the person who opens the door, which is why we named our session that, to the person who's in the transport van, to the person who is delivering the food, to the frontline staff, to the individuals that are drafting the policies. We have to understand not only what trauma is, we have to understand the trauma impacts and the behaviors, that these are symptoms of the trauma, and that we can't label kids because of that behavior. And then the next two steps of that is that we are creating tools and resources in translating that information into practice, and that every single aspect of how we write policy, how we respond to it, is making sure that we are reducing the possibility of re-traumatizing that survivor. And every day at the National Center, I'm having conversations with social workers and law enforcement where I think we've really saturated the term trauma, right? Everybody knows trauma. We saw on the poll, people, you know, they know what that means now. And we really understand the trauma symptoms that go along with that. But I think that we have a lot of work to do in translating that into the practice aspect and into policies and procedures that make sure that we are reducing the opportunity to re-traumatize. I know T and I talk quite a bit about how upon recovery, there's a lot of times, and I would say weekly, that I'm having conversations with social workers where it's taking 3, 4, 6 hours for somebody to respond because we have multi-jurisdictional situations going on. And instead of the response being, that's our kid and we need to do everything we can to make sure that person gets everything they need, there's a lot more finger pointing of not my kid, who's responsible. And when that's the message that we're getting in practice to that young person, then we shouldn't be surprised when they run from their placement. We shouldn't be surprised when they run back to their trafficker. So I think we do have some work to do in that area.
And can I just follow up, because another point that you made is that, you know, I think that we also have to address kind of the policies and procedures that are in place in the child welfare that kind of exacerbate the lack of opportunity to really see people from that lens. It's a real reality that young people get placed and they have this report on them. And we really need to start giving young people the opportunity to show who they are besides the report, and having that opportunity to show that and that they're not who they used to be or what they used to be, because all too often when we engage with young people and we're basing our relationships, our interactions off of that negative report, oftentimes it's negative based, you know, we don't give that young person a really fair chance for that first opportunity of initial contact. We don't give that, you know, opportunity for them to make their own way. And so inadvertently, subconsciously, a lot of people start to act and treat that child much of what they read. And, you know, this can only continue to, you know, unfortunately perpetuate into negative self-fulfilling prophecies.
It's about being child-centered.
Child-centered.
Which is what you said right from the get-go. So thank you. Well, let's hear how Connecticut is addressing the issues that T has brought up. What are you all doing? I know it's good stuff.
Tammy responds.
It's good stuff. We have been working on this, many tremendous people for a number of years now. and we've come a long ways. We have a lot of work to do. I think I get the question a lot, where did you start? Did you start with the training? Did you start with the services? And you really have to just start with both. We, until a year and a half ago, and thank you ACF, we had no funding to take this on. So our approach has been training up our entire system, about giving people the lens to understand trafficking, child exploitation, giving them the foundation to start working with these kids, and developing a team approach where we're all in this together. I did a training for some judges a couple of weeks ago, and they were an amazing group of judges. But we have to get to every layer. If we're doing all this work with the kid in the child welfare system, and then she's approached on the street by a police officer and or approached by, the judge's response when she's in the courtroom, and it's very, very adverse, it really minimizes all the efforts we've done. So much of our focus has been on training the entire state, everyone from our legal folks to our juvenile justice folks to the community. We've even have a wonderful faith-based community through the Underground that has gone through our trainings and actually does training for us in the community on a regular basis. So even if a young person, preferably if a young person never touches child welfare, we want the community to be able to first, foremost prevent, but if they are involved, then reach out for the supports and services. And lastly, we're very focused right now on education. We're using a curriculum called Not a Number, developed by Love 146, really focused on educating kids, because if everybody up here is very trafficking focused and we're all using the right words, we're all supporting, we have the kid at the center, but then when she's in her community and the response from her peers is negative or adverse, that is really a horrible response, because kids are very centered with their peer group during the adolescent years. So that's also a very recent focus for us, and we're seeing some progress there as well.
You all also have a screening tool, and if you could speak to that and how you developed that. You spoke about the education. What came first? Was it the screening tool? Was it the education? How did all of that fit together?
Without giving you, at least 8 years of history, it was a little bit of both. But we were put in a position, and actually it was based on an international case possibly coming in, of having to respond to such cases. So a group of folks, predominantly through our care line, developed kind of an immediate response to what to do. And that has evolved over the years. And now what we have is our practice guide and decision map. And it gives the workforce kind of a lens to look at these cases, to start looking at the red flags. And then when these cases are called into our care line, it gives them the framework on the different areas that they really need to address. But we had this conversation yesterday, we have to be cautious, because we may not be seeing some of the red flags initially. Melissa may not see some of the red flags, Tammy may not see some of the red flags, but T, when she's out there mentoring kids, there are things that she may pick up. So we can't get so dependent on this one-time process. It really has to be an ongoing process to work with these kids and identify kids that are at risk and or kids that are being victimized.
I think that's such an important point, that it's a process and an ongoing thing. Do you want to speak?
Oh, I
to
just
that?
wanted to say something to that, because that is such an important point, because people
Yeah.
have to understand that it's also a process for the aspect of recovery. And so recidivism is a real issue that comes up. So that the process has to be thoroughly supportive of that process as well.
Very, very good point. It's tough work. It's really tough being a survivor going through that process. It's also tough for the workers trying to support the survivor and really wanting to keep him or her safe. And we tend to want to put them in secure settings, lock them up. Most often it's from the right place, but it's not necessarily the right approach. So again, it's really about partnering, having our young people front and center, and supporting each other. So if Melissa's making a decision not to put a kid in a secure setting, because that's really not a trauma-informed approach, when that young person goes back out into the community and not in such a great way, and we're all losing some sleep, I shouldn't be blaming Melissa. It's really about how can we re-engage this young person and keep him or her safe.
Yes.
the center right there. Melissa, I know that agencies are thinking about the screening tool right now. Could you just spend some time talking to us about what agencies should consider when selecting a screening tool, knowing that it's not just a one-time thing?
Absolutely, and I think really Tammy and T laid out one of the most important aspects, and that training is so important, and that when we talk about screening tools, that we really need to shift the focus from a screening tool to a much broader perspective in taking the responsibility off of the young person to disclose, self-identify, be able to understand or put words around something that they've not even had time or space or safety to process. And so we need to put that responsibility onto the professionals to know what to look for, what are the red flags, what are the indicators, and then create policies that allow services to be engaged without necessarily an identification or a disclosure because of the critical mass of information that's being collected by multiple team members. So really broadening that perspective and allowing for that space where trust and rapport can be built, and then that survivor can then begin to share some of that information. I think one of the other important aspects, and Lauren mentioned this in the opening, is that with the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, amending CAPTA, that while there's a kind of a timeline right now with PL 113183 to get a screening tool in place, that we need to make sure that we're aligning our laws and our policies to be inclusive of all forms of child sex trafficking, familial, non-familial, those who are being commercially sexually exploited without an identified pimp, right? Because all of that is involved in the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And so we need to make sure that we're not jumping to develop some type of screening tool, integrating that into the fabric of how we identify these young people without making sure that we're aligning our policies and laws to be inclusive of all forms of trafficking.
Great, thank you. I've got a question for T now. What are some of the challenges that child welfare should expect to face in identifying survivors of child sex trafficking? I know you've spoken about some of them. We'd also like to have some suggestions or tips for then how to address these challenges.
Well, the first one, and it's the main one that, there's not really a big suggestion or tip to say, but one of the biggest challenges is that you don't have survivors who self-identify. And that is a real reality. And the reason being is that these young people were, in a sense, taught through observational learning or other means that this is the means of survival, this is the way to live, this is what they're supposed to do. They do not see themselves as a victim because it was never presented to them as that, but because they are a young person, they're not even understanding. I mean, I know we're gonna get to it deeper in this panel, but their brain isn't even fully developed to be able to understand being a victim. So that's the first thing that I can't really give you a suggestion or a solution in how to face that, because that's just a real reality of human, processing and feeling. The other one is that, there is not clear cultural competence. And this is so important because so often there's people who are like, oh, well, should we be looking at the way she dresses, or he or she dresses, or the way he and she talks? That I think cultural competence specifically in understanding youth competence is very important. I'm gonna give you a small example. There's a song that if you hear a young person singing out loud, if someone was in the child welfare system, they may think, oh, well, they're being trafficked because they're singing this song out loud. It's by one of the most well-known rappers alive, and it's by Drake. And he has a song, and please forgive me, I hope we're all adults here, but he has a song that says, my sex is so good, I shouldn't have to for free. And that essentially is a part of this youth culture, that this is a song that's going out, that's being played. So if you hear a young person singing that and you don't understand the competence of this as a part of their youth culture, then you may misidentify. So that's another issue. It's not just clothes, it's not just, if they have multiple cell phones, there's other ways to identify that. And how you really distinguish is being very aware and culturally competent of their youth culture, of their background and ethnicity, their culture of that, the traditions of, some of the communities that they come from, so that. Also, a lot of child welfare workers do not understand, or I wouldn't even say workers because that's just not the right thing, but I think a lot of people in child welfare do not understand what Stockholm Syndrome really is and really give heed to those important attachment issues and how Stockholm Syndrome and the allegiance that it seems from a young person to their trafficker is essentially another trauma bond. And so that we need to really be more aware of that. And again, going back to, sexuality. When we talk about identifying young people, we can't just make, assumptions based on if they, choose to be LGBTQ or not. I think oftentimes we really limit young people, and we not only just, misidentify them, but we also can have an opportunity in putting our hand in confusion. For example, there's young boys who have been trafficked, by men, but they identify as straight. And that is something that we should not be depicting someone's sexuality onto them. And also the fact that the discussion around sexuality, specifically working with young people who have been trafficked and from the child welfare system, is important. It's an important discussion that needs to happen at all times.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, T. So, Tammy, I'd like to go back to what's happening in Connecticut. What has been the most important thing that your agency has had to adjust to in meeting the needs of sex trafficking survivors?
Well, I think there's a few areas, but I'm going to focus on, I think, what I hear nationally on a regular basis is the assumption that these kids should not all go to child welfare, that they're not our kids, or they're not all our kids and we don't have the resources. And we came to the reality a long time ago that if a young person is being bought and sold for sex, that something's going on and we have a responsibility to at least support that young person. It doesn't mean we need to take them into our custody, but it does mean that we have the connection to resources and people and supports, and that it's our responsibility. And that was tough. I think people were afraid, and I hear it across the country. If we accept these cases, and we accept all of our cases into Careline, and we respond to every case into our Careline, and the fear was we're going to get so many cases, we're not going to be able to manage them. And the reality is we need to figure that out, and until you do it, you really don't know what the numbers are going to look like. And you also start to realize these are kids we should have served much earlier, that we should have had a different lens. You probably shouldn't have gone through our juvenile justice system. So I think just kind of adjusting to the realities of who these kids are, and that we have a responsibility to be able to respond to them.
Great, great. All right, I've got a couple more questions here. First of all, I want to address what T was talking about in terms of cultural competence. I'm throwing this in here. I hope that's okay. Tammy and Melissa, could you please address that issue of being culturally responsive in working with survivors?
Tammy responds.
I think we have to meet the young person and the family where they're at, and we can't make assumptions. And T said that in her first piece, as well as during these discussions, is that we have to understand who we're working with, and we can't take our values, our beliefs, and place them on that young person.
Right.
And that's really tough for some folks, especially when we're seeing some dynamics play out in the community that make us uncomfortable. So it's really about getting in touch with that and getting support, and know that we all have our own biases, and we have to be able to recognize that and support each other, and know when we have to reach out to others to be able to work with a particular family or a particular young person.
Melissa responds.
Yeah, if I can add one thing to that, I think one of the things that we're seeing in the field is the importance of also supporting the family, and that when we have a young person and they are taken into care for however long, that eventually they will return to community, and that if we haven't prepared them for what that integration looks like, and we haven't prepared them and we haven't sensitized the community, then we are really almost feeding them to the wolves in returning them back to that, and we're setting them up for some really significant hurdles in reintegrating back into that community. So supporting family comprehensively, figuring out what some of those family issues may have been that led to certain vulnerabilities, not to necessarily a bad family dynamic, but some vulnerabilities, or making sure that we're identifying some of those issues and addressing them long term.
T responds.
And just following up on that, because you really made me think about something about assimilation. And I think that that's not something that we talk about enough with these safe houses. You take, for example, a young girl who has been trafficked and, right there in the city in Atlanta, and you take her to rural Georgia, and you put her up for 2 years, and she will flourish. She's going to do great. But as soon as you bring her back to Atlanta, she's going to fall into the same communities with the same peoples. So we have to do more, specifically when we have programs in homes like that, of having practices to reassimilate back into the city and the community where you come from, because again, it goes off of your point very well, Melissa.
Melissa.
And can I add one more thing to that too? Sorry. One of the things that in the field of trafficking that we focused on first was female-focused intervention strategies. And I think that was because that's what we were seeing the most of. And one of the things that we knew then, and we know even more now, is that, of course, boys, LGBTQ youth are extremely vulnerable and are also being trafficked. And so we need to make sure that screening tools, intervention strategies, everything across the board, service delivery, is also being mindful of serving every different type of community, every different type of individual, and every different type of trafficking situation.
Excellent. All right, we are going to wrap up our panel, but I just want to first ask Tammy and T, last couple of words of wisdom that you might have for our audience here.
Tammy responds.
I think we've seen the most impact, and we're kind of fairly new into it, is developing strong relationships for these kids that are in this for the long road with them. We have an amazing partner, Love 146, that does survivor care with them.
Okay.
And just having those persons be there with that kid, that young person through their journey, no matter what they're going through. Leave the judgment at home, and these professionals are able to do that, meet the kids where they're at, and not just focus on safety, because if we do, I think we end up going down juvenile justice kind of roads with these kids, and that's not fair, and it's not trauma-informed, it's not appropriate.
And T, last word.
And I just basically, following up on that, really believe in the youth-centered approach. Again, I really advocate for things like TDMs and TLCs that allow young people to be the voice, to talk about some of those challenges, some of those needs. Because I'm sorry to say, but the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. So we can do all the work that we want to do, but if we don't have that partnership with the young person and who it's for, then we're not going to make any way and any difference. And so I want to leave you with a quote that really is not just, basically, it's more of a concept, because I think that we all can see how hard this gets and how frustrating this gets. And so there's a quote that I think is very important. It's by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and it goes like this: "The test of first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still have the ability to function. One should, for example, see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise." And this is that group. This is that conference, and the people who are participating, we will be that group to make it otherwise. So thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you to our panel, but we're not done yet. No. We still want to cover some other stuff. Thank you so much. Right now, we're going to make it a little bit more real for you, and we're going to show you some resources that are available here at the center. As part of the Child Welfare Response to Sex Trafficking Learning Experience, and a learning experience, by the way, is a collection of resources that the center offers to help build knowledge and skill, we have developed some digital stories to accompany curriculum that we've developed that addresses all of these things that we've talked about today. The storytellers of these digital stories include survivors, caseworkers, and supervisors and caregivers. And we'd like to show you a video story that was done by a survivor, and we are so honored to have the author, the storyteller of that digital story here with us. I'd like to introduce Sydney Nastasi, and she's going to tell us about her digital story, and then we're going to show it.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Charmaine. And of course, a very special thank you to the entire Child Welfare Virtual Expo, because as T so graciously said, this is such a difficult conversation to have, but it is one that we need to have. So I'm very honored to be here today to help lead in that discussion. And I'd like to start off with a quote. Maya Angelou once said, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." For so long, I bared the untold story of being sex trafficked as a child. And every single day, thousands of children are forced to bear similar stories, to hold back, to silence themselves, and to confine themselves within the very tiny box that our pimps, our traffickers placed us into with their greedy, violent hands so long ago. But I say, no more. No more silence. No more holding back. No more of that tiny damn box. Now I am free. T is free. We're free to express our passions. I'm free to express my validated frustration and concerns with our criminal justice and child welfare systems in regards to how we handle child sex trafficking today still. I am free to tell my story, and I'm free now to inspire and advocate for others until every single child is just as free as I am. So without further ado, I present to you the untold story that I bared for too long, now being told as loudly and proudly as I possibly could. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy this and it inspires you.
A girl's chest covered in bruises and the words "for sale."
What were you wearing when this happened to you? Were you drinking? Were you doing drugs? Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you tell somebody sooner? These are the questions I was asked when I told authorities what happened. These questions are the reason I always said to people, I don't want to talk about it. I walked into a door. I'm just tired. Nothing happened. But something did happen. I was 13 years old the first time I was drugged and sold for sex as if I had a price tag hanging off of my bare skin.
Girl with a black eye looking in the mirror.
I was 13 years old the first time a man who was supposed to protect me betrayed my trust to get his fix. I was 13 years old the first time I was asked, "What were you wearing?" by a detective. I was 14 years old when I was put into a mental health institution because I couldn't cope with what had happened to me.
Wiping away "for sale."
I was 14 years old when a psychiatrist asked me, "Why did he sell you for drugs?" as if I hadn't already asked myself that. I was 15 years old when I had to show up for court because he still has rights despite him taking away my own. I was 15 years old when a judge decided before my own eyes that my pain was only worth less than 5 years.
Applying makeup.
I was 15 years old when I decided to make a change.
Clothing discarded on the tile floor.
I was 16 years old when I stopped letting people refer to me as a victim. I was 16 years old when I accepted myself as a survivor. I was 16 years old when I took this issue into my own hands.
Donning a t-shirt.
I am 17 years old, and my trafficker was just released from prison. I am 17 years old, and I refuse to let this uproot my life again. I am 17 years old and have found the strength to tell my story to others in order to spread awareness. I am 17 years old, and I am stronger than ever despite the obstacles that I have faced. I am 17 years old, and I am a survivor.
Text on the shirt, "Stop Modern Slavery," holding a sign, "I am not for sale." A special thank you to Amelia Rubenstein, Melissa Snow, Olga Lavoff, Joan Morse, Brenda Lockwood, Jasmina Chuck, Danielle Nastasi, and to myself for finding the strength to escape and survive. Quotation: "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." Maya Angelou. This story was created in a digital storytelling workshop, a service of the Capacity Building Centers for States funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau, CB, under contract HHSP 233-201-400-033C. Logos appear for the Children's Bureau and the Capacity Building Center for States.
Thank you so much, Sydney. That was really beautiful. And in case you're wondering what the person was saying, that was an example of an audio described version, and this makes it ADA compliant and accessible. So we have that available in all of our resources. Before you go, Sydney, though, I'm just wondering, how has telling this story impacted you?
It's been a very humbling experience. The one word I can say to really describe it is validating. So many times as a survivor, you're told initially that your concerns and your voice doesn't matter. And I think that through making this story and creating it and sharing it and making strides with it, I really have just become so validated and so humbled to say that I am making a difference, and that right there is what outweighs everything else that happened. When you see that benefit and you see the world around you changing because of something that you did. So I really think it was an amazing experience, and I hope to inspire others with it.
Well, we are very grateful for your telling your story. And Sydney and T, you two are making a difference, a very important difference, so thank you for that. And the center has these resources available on CAP Learn on our webpage. We've got curriculum that addresses caseworkers, supervisors, caregivers. We've also got the handouts associated with that curriculum and PowerPoints, and they're all available on CAP Learn. We also just completed part 2 of our learning experience, and we've developed a series of videos that are more about how to interact with survivors. We're going to watch a clip of this video now, and there are clips of these videos that are shown throughout the curriculum, and there are directions in the curriculum about how to use it. So let's take a look at Amber McDonald speaking about how to interact with survivors.
Approaching the situation authentically and open-minded is the key to obtaining information from these youth. There is not one story behind youth who have experienced commercial sex. There are many. Factors contributing to the entry and living in the world of commercial sex can be fluid. For example, Nicole mentions how she entered by being lured through a hello, and how she needs others to acknowledge that she's different than who she used to be. This is critical. As those who are providing assessments, we need to evaluate the backstory of how someone who approached her with just a hello compelled her to get involved in commercial sex. What were the fundamental components of attachment that she was missing? You may find that it was simply being a young person, as they are inherently vulnerable. But it's your job to uncover what it is in order to move through addressing it.
In an office, a female caseworker speaks with a girl who has been a victim of sex trafficking. The girl's posture is slumped and her body language appears closed off, although she seems to be listening and responding to the social worker.
The youth you encounter may initially present as delinquent and frustrating to work with. Setting boundaries and maintaining your honesty and authenticity will demonstrate your integrity. And that's really the most important thing that they care about. Youth's reluctance will manifest in your attempt to interview them. Many of these youth will refuse to talk to you or will be purposefully vague. Do your best to not let this frustrate you. Keep in mind, these youth are not consciously delinquent or difficult. Most of the time, they're not providing you with information because they know that you are going to disrupt something they perceive as good or beneficial. Acknowledging that is a good start to some dialogue. For example, you may say to a youth, initially when you encounter them, that you understand that this situation may be difficult and that they may not want to speak with you.
A female caseworker speaking with a different female sex trafficking victim. The girl has her arms folded protectively across her body.
Validate their feelings about that and then move on from there. There will be times when youth aren't talking to you because they have been threatened. I would encourage you to always ask about threats, but listen to the answer they give and their perception of safety as a concern. Address their perceptions, not your own. If they're not scared, validate their fears of removal and have an authentic conversation providing them with accurate information so they may make a decision on how much information they want to provide you. Do not lie to them in order to obtain information. Honesty is always the best policy. Also, this is a great opportunity to validate the strength and courage it takes to survive on the streets. This is another example of demonstrating your authenticity.
Hi, thank you very much. And this clip illustrates just what we've been talking about. You can access these resources on CAP Learn, which is the learning management system on the center's website. Go to the website, look for Learn or resources on the ribbon, and somebody will be putting that up. There will be a link to it, and you can access all of these materials and once you registered and download them. So I would encourage you to do that. We can also tell you more about that during our exhibit time in between sessions. So we'll all be in the networking lounge, so please join us. We would love to chat with you. I think we have time, we just have just a few minutes for a couple of questions. So right now I'm going to be looking for some questions. You can type them in the chat feature. All right, here's the question. Let's ask this for Tammy and then T. What would you tell caseworkers who work with sex trafficking survivors?
Be very careful not to judge. Really think long term. Don't attempt to solve all their problems while you're sitting there with them. I think we all do that in good intent. And then also get support from others, because again, it's really, really tough. And if you find yourself getting tired, it's time for you to ask a colleague for some support.
And amen to all of that, because that is definitely what I would say. Another thing is that when we talk about, building that trust and that rapport, is that this is what it looks like for the young person. You come in and you're asking them a million questions about their life, and you tell them nothing about who you are. So we have to do more in regards of building that simple, basic rapport. Let them know about yourself. Let them know that kind of music you listen to. And also, don't jump into the immediate serious questions of like how long you've been traveling. Try to get to know that young person. What are some of your interests? What are things that you're into? Oh, I like that too. Oh, you like that artist? I like an artist like that. Or they perform together. Or try to make some connectionality, and specifically share of yourself. Now, granted, there are policies and protocols that say you can only give so much, but you can talk about stories where you learned a lesson. You can talk about things that interest to you. And I would say start there, because they have enough people asking them those serious questions. You will get there in time if you build that rapport.
Great, great. We have another question. This is for Melissa. Where did the statistic 1 in 5 youth who are in care have been victims of sex trafficking? Where did that come from?
Great question. So that came specifically from data that is available through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So it is only reflective of the cases of runaways that were reported in to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and is based on that data set.
And you can find more information about that at the exhibit booth that you're going to be at in just a few minutes, right?
Absolutely. Come on over and join us. We're going to be talking about children missing from care, reporting into the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and I'd be happy to talk more about some of the data as well.
All right, great. And then do we have any more questions? I hear the question is not a number evidence-based?
Tammy responds.
Not at this time. That is their goal. They are looking at a research project around this particular model. They just started this project probably about a year and a half ago. It's been totally funded through supports to Love 146. Until recently, we just expanded statewide through some OBS and DCF funding, so we're super excited about that. So we should have the numbers and the support to actually go in this direction.
The evidence base is growing, that's for sure.
It is, it is.
So do we have any other questions at this time? I want to give time for our panelists just to say a couple of words on our way out here. Tammy, do you want to start?
Sure. I think we're talking a lot about child welfare, which makes sense due to the overall Expo focus. But I also want to stress that we need to educate our young people in our education community in the schools to do more for prevention and intervention early on. So I would stress that. And then also, kids, young people need living wage jobs. They need careers. It doesn't mean they're going to go get their PhDs. Some of them aren't, but they need opportunities to be successful adults. And until we focus on educating our kids and then providing them opportunities, we'll continue to have some of these struggles.
Okay, Melissa, you got about 10 seconds.
All right. So I think that one of the most important aspects is really focused on the strength-based approach and really seeing, I know this is a tough issue, and once we see the victimization, it is incredibly difficult to deal with sometimes. And yet, these are some of the most courageous, resilient, and amazing individuals that I think any of us have had the opportunity to engage with. And so, seeing the strength, seeing the fact that they have incredible skills that allowed them to survive, and that actually could be the reason that they're sitting in front of you in that moment. And take that moment to acknowledge those skills, acknowledge that resiliency, and use that to build from.
T.
Amen to that. Amen to that. What more can you say? There's a lot of advancement we've had. There's a long way to go. But like the quote said, you know, we can make the difference. We can, you know, look forward in good faith that there can be change. And I think specifically, you know, I know that our roads have been different for both Sydney and I, but we are examples of just a small example. And to remember that there are young people, as we are sitting here in this moment, there are young people who are going through this atrocity, who are still dealing with this as an everyday reality. And this is who we fight on behalf for.
Yes. Wow. All right, now I have the unenviable task of concluding this panel because you all have been amazing. Thank you, one and all.
Charmaine describes day of operations that are no longer available.
As you exit this session, we encourage you to take a couple of minutes to complete the evaluation, and then we will have you go into the exhibit hall, and then you have the opportunity to engage in a virtual chat with Melissa at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children from 12 o'clock to 12:20 Eastern Standard Time. And Tammy and I and T and Sydney will all also be in the networking lounge. So if you'd like to come in and talk to us, please, if you have any questions, we may not have been able to answer to them, but we will get back to you on all of the questions. Again, thank you everyone for sharing with us. We appreciate it.
To search for Child Welfare Virtual Expo activity on Twitter, use hashtag CWVE. The Virtual Expo is presented by the Children's Bureau and the Capacity Building Center for States.